each screening, there was a talking going on. And I was like watching the audience going, what? The second time it happened, again, third time, talking in this one particular spot. And I'm thinking, what, did we do something wrong?
For years, Ellen DeGeneres built one of the safest images in television. Every afternoon, she danced onto the stage, made people laugh, surprised strangers with gifts, and signed off with the same simple message: be kind. That phrase wasn't just a catchline, it was the entire machine. It turned Ellen into more than a host. It turned her into a brand people trusted without even thinking about it. And that's exactly why her fall hit so differently. Because when a celebrity gets exposed as difficult, people move on. But when someone builds an empire on kindness, and the people around that empire start describing something completely different, the audience doesn't just feel disappointed. They feel played. And once that feeling sets in, every old clip, every awkward interview, and every rumor starts looking a lot more serious than it did before.
She lost everything. She fell apart, disappeared, because people found out that this character that she was portraying in a half an hour on a television show is not really who she was. My buddy Greg, who was one of her writers, was like, she's a piece. And he was like, she's a monster.
At first, the cracks were easy to ignore. Ellen had spent years looking untouchable. She wasn't just another talk show host fighting for headlines. She was daytime comfort food, safe for families, safe for advertisers, safe for celebrities who wanted a friendly interview instead of a brutal one. That's why so many people were stunned when former employees started describing a workplace that felt nothing like the image viewers had been sold. Suddenly, the woman who reminded America to be nice was being accused of running a culture where staff felt nervous, shut out, and constantly on edge. And the most damaging part?
Ellen DeGeneres feeling the heat as more employees, past and present from her show, say that they were working in a toxic environment. Some Hollywood actors also speaking out against the talk show host now.
Wasn't just the allegations themselves, it was the contradiction. The entire brand had been built on warmth. So the second that warmth started looking performative, the story became much bigger than bad press. It became a betrayal, but that was only the beginning. Then the floodgates really opened. Reports about a toxic workplace exploded across entertainment media. An internal investigation followed. 3 senior producers were removed.
Against Ellen and her company, and Ellen had 3 of the show's top producers quietly parted ways with the show because of it. But it wasn't just employees. In 2018, an audience member named Dana DiMatteo said she was literally told not to be funnier than Ellen. You see, Dana was a real fan, not just watching from her couch. She flew from Chicago to Los Angeles.
Ellen came back on air and apologized, telling viewers she was a work in progress. But by then, the energy had already changed. The apology didn't feel like a reset. It felt like the moment millions of viewers realized the version of Ellen they had watched for years might not be the full version at all. And once the public starts wondering what else they missed, that's when a celebrity's past gets re-examined in the harshest way possible. Old moments stop looking funny. Old stories stop sounding random. Even silence starts to look suspicious. And that's exactly what happened here. The truth is, stars survive scandals all the time. Hollywood is full of people who bounce back from worse. But hypocrisy is the one thing audiences almost never forgive. If a celebrity is blunt, difficult, moody, or arrogant from day one, people accept it as part of the package. But if someone spends nearly 2 decades selling themselves as the nicest person in the room, then gets accused of being the opposite behind closed doors, the backlash hits harder. It doesn't just damage a career, it rewrites the whole image. That's why the end of Ellen's show felt bigger than a normal cancellation story. It felt like the end of a carefully managed illusion. And once that illusion collapsed,
It got completely soaked. And when it was over, she was told to go backstage in her soaking wet clothes, and then nothing. They just left us there, she said. We waited pretty much the whole show in our soaking wet clothes for someone to bring us dry things to change into.
People started looking beyond Ellen's studio and asking a much darker question. If one of the most polished brands in Hollywood could crack this badly, what else in that world was fake too? That question is part of why old Ricky Gervais moments suddenly started hitting differently. Back at the Golden Globes, Gervais had made a career out of saying the things other people in that room would never dare say out loud. He mocked the industry's moral grandstanding. He made fun of powerful names, and when he brought up Jeffrey Epstein, the line that landed with a thud wasn't funny because nobody thought it was a joke. It felt like one of those moments where a comedian stops being a comedian for a second and becomes a guy pointing at the elephant in the room. Viewers went back to those clips later and saw something more than a roast. They saw a room full of powerful people going tense at the mention of a name they clearly wished would disappear. That didn't prove every internet theory people later attached to Hollywood, but it did feed a growing suspicion that the public only gets the polished version of this business, while the messier truth stays behind velvet ropes. And once people start seeing Hollywood that way, they don't stop at one target.
Answers. You see, Ellen's past is full of unexplained passing aways, mysterious.
That's also why Jim Caviezel found such a huge audience outside the traditional media bubble. Caviezel had become one of the loudest voices pushing the idea that something deeply rotten was hiding inside elite circles. Then Sound of Freedom arrived and exploded at the box office, turning him into a kind of anti-Hollywood symbol for viewers who already distrusted the entertainment industry. But here's where the story gets more complicated. The movie became a real hit, but it also got pulled into major controversy because Caviezel had publicly repeated QAnon-linked claims, and critics argued that both the marketing and the larger conversation around the film blurred the line between real trafficking issues and conspiracy rhetoric. That matters because it helps explain the exact climate Ellen's downfall happened in. This wasn't just a moment where one host got exposed. It was a moment when millions of people were already primed to believe that powerful institutions were hiding uglier truths than they admitted. So when Ellen's image cracked, the internet didn't react with ordinary gossip. It reacted like it had found another missing piece of a much bigger puzzle. And that's when things got even darker. Once Ellen stopped feeling untouchable, people began dragging every emotionally charged story connected to her back into public view.
Hence, not just passionate consuming. Friends of the couple later described them as inseparable. Then Ellen pulled back. Why? Industry pressures, fear of being blackballed, rumors that studios were threatening to pull projects if Ellen stayed publicly linked to Anne. So Ellen made a choice, career over love. And Anne was left.
Ellen was far from nice.
The biggest was Anne Heche. Their relationship had once been one of the most talked about romances in celebrity culture, and years later, after Hitch's tragic death, online speculation exploded all over again. But the official record matters here. Anne Heche's death was ruled an accident caused by inhalation and thermal injuries after her crash. Still, because Ellen's reputation had already collapsed by that point, internet culture did what it always does when trust disappears. It filled every gap with suspicion. Suddenly, people weren't just reacting to the facts of a tragedy, they were folding that tragedy into a larger story about Ellen's orbit, her past, and the public's growing belief that nothing in Hollywood is ever as simple as it looks. And once that kind of thinking takes hold, it doesn't stay contained to one name. Then there was Stephen Twitch Boss, maybe the most joyful face associated with Ellen's show in its later years. He wasn't just the DJ, he became part of the emotional identity of the program itself, always smiling, always dancing, always adding warmth to the set. So when he died, it shocked people in a completely different way. Officially, his death was ruled S-year.
Opened it, she said she was looking for a spaceship to take her to heaven. She was hospitalized, diagnosed with a mental breakdown. She eventually recovered and she rebuilt her life. Married a man named James Tupper, had a son, Atlas, kept acting, kept going. For 22 years, Anne Heche survived. But then came August 5th, 2022. Anne was driving her blue Mini Cooper through West Los Angeles, Mar Vista neighborhood, around 11 a.m. What happened next is still being debated to this day.
What happened out here at LA City Fire Department, I gotta give it to them right off the
side, and the autopsy found no drugs or alcohol in his system at the time of death. Later, his widow Allison Holker revealed she had discovered a hidden stash of drugs in their home after his death, which sparked a whole new wave of conversation online.
And that car catches fire. And when we say into a structure, I mean all the way in, almost coming out the other side. This house out here on Walgrove, right at the cross of Brookhaven, at Preston, you can see.
And that's where this story becomes less about one person and more about what happens when a public figure loses trust. Because after Ellen's image fell apart, many viewers stopped seeing these tragedies as isolated events near her world and started viewing them through the most suspicious lens possible. Fair or not, that's what happens when a brand built on moral certainty collapses in public. People go back and question everything that once felt normal. And then came the part that pushed the internet into overdrive, the Epstein file frenzy. The second document dumps, celebrity mentions, and online rumor threads started circulating again, Ellen's name got dragged into the storm almost instantly. For a lot of people, this felt like confirmation of every fear they already had about Hollywood. But the reality is more complicated and a lot less dramatic than the internet wanted it to be. Fact checks found that Ellen's name appeared in limited and indirect ways, and that a mention in large document collections is not proof of wrongdoing. But by that point, facts were almost beside the point. The real story was how quickly people were willing to believe the worst. That's the consequence of a shattered image. Once the public decides you've been fake in one area, they become open to believing almost anything in every other area. So the Epstein discussion mattered, not because it clearly proved some explosive secret about Ellen, but because it showed how far public trust in her had collapsed. She was no longer being judged like a celebrity with a damaged reputation. She was being treated like a symbol of a larger sickness people believed existed in Hollywood. That's what makes the ending of this story so strange. Ellen didn't go down in one clean, explosive moment. She faded out through layers. First came the employee allegations. Then came the apology that didn't fully reset anything. Then came the end of the show. Then the comeback attempt in stand-up, where she mocked the idea that she had been kicked out of show business for being mean. And then, as if to make the whole thing feel even more surreal, she left America and moved to England. Ellen later said the move was tied to Donald Trump's re-election and concerns about life in the United States, while other reports said she had simply fallen in love with a house there. But to the public, the timing fed the mystery even more. Because once someone's image falls apart, even ordinary decisions stop looking ordinary. A move becomes an escape. Silence becomes strategy. Privacy becomes proof that something bigger happened behind the scenes. And in Ellen's case, the audience had already reached the point where they no longer wanted a simple explanation. Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. Ellen's downfall wasn't powered by one headline. It was powered by the collapse of credibility. The Be Kind image was so clean, so polished, and so repeated that once it cracked, people didn't just question her workplace. They questioned her friendships, her history, her silence, and every story that touched her orbit. Ricky Gervais's old jokes felt sharper. Jim Caviezel's warnings found a more receptive crowd. Tragedies connected to Ellen's world got pulled into darker conversations. Rumors spread faster because people were suddenly willing to imagine far more than what had actually been proven. And in the middle of all of it was one simple, brutal truth. Once the public stops believing your image, they start rewriting your entire story for you. That's why Ellen remains such a fascinating case. Not because every rumor about her is true, not because every internet theory holds up, but because her collapse shows how quickly fame can reverse when the brand and the reality stop matching. For years, Ellen looked like one of the safest people in entertainment. Then the image slipped, and suddenly she looked like someone audiences had never really known at all. And maybe that's why this story still refuses to die. Because people aren't just asking what happened to Ellen DeGeneres. They're asking how many other stars are still being protected by an image that would fall apart the second the curtain gets pulled back.